On a windless summer day in 1995, 4 children stepped onto a boat and were never seen again. Decades later, the lake still refuses to answer the simplest question: where did they go? Stay with us as we uncover what was hidden. Like this video, and subscribe so you don't miss what the water reveals next. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask to be remembered. Gray light filtering through high clouds, the wind barely present, the lake surface smooth as stained glass. Still, silent. And then, a man walking his dog along the perimeter trail saw it something small, worn, nestled in the reeds like it had grown there. A child's shoe. Sun-bleached, the leather stiff, the laces curled into themselves like sleeping snakes. No markings, no color left to speak of, just a shape that didn't belong. He didn't touch it at first. Something about it felt wrong, too out of place. The kind of wrong that makes your stomach turn without knowing why. The dog had sniffed at it, whined, then backed away. It took nearly 15 minutes before he finally picked it up with a branch and dropped it into a plastic grocery bag. He drove straight to the sheriff's office. He didn't speak for a while, just handed over the bag and muttered, "I think it might be from back then." Back then. As if everyone knew what that meant. As if time had twisted around this place and never let go. Lake Whitney had long been a wound that healed wrong. It pretended to be serene, now a place for fishing, weekend retreats, photos of the sun setting over the dock. But locals still talked about the summer of 1995 in lowered voices. The year the cousins disappeared, the year 4 children went into the lake and never came back. They were never found. Not really. There was a search, weeks of it. Divers, helicopters, thermal cameras. Rumors that stretched from the plausible to the absurd. And then, like fog burning off at noon, it all just stopped. But the families hadn't stopped, not really. Some moved away. Some stayed and shriveled like old tree stumps by the water. They came back each anniversary, left stuffed animals on the dock. Flowers wilted in the heat. The cousins' names were etched in the minds of those who lived there like a carving in wet concrete. Fixed, permanent. And yet the lake remained quiet, as if complicit. When the shoe arrived at the FBI's cold case unit in 2025, it was treated like an artifact. Lab tests. Chemical analysis. Soil residue. What they found stunned even the skeptics. Fibers that matched one of the children's shirts. Trace DNA. Impossible odds that collided with an improbable truth. This wasn't just a random shoe, it was theirs. And that was how the whisper began. A hush across backrooms and inboxes. A story resurrected not by discovery, but by echo. Something had shifted, like the lake itself had grown tired of keeping its silence. The press didn't get the story right away. The shoe was catalogued, quietly. Field agents were deployed, discreetly. The lake was scanned again, new sonar, new maps, new eyes. People who hadn't spoken about it in decades suddenly found themselves staring out at the water again, wondering what it might return next. Some said it was a sign, others called it a haunting. But beneath the speculation, a singular, inescapable truth took hold. The lake was not done. Not yet. The 2nd of July, 1995, began with the kind of sky that made people forget danger existed. A sheet of unbroken blue stretched over central Texas. Sunlight poured down in golden floods, and Lake Whitney shimmered like a mirror too bright to look at directly. It was the Sunday before Independence Day, and the lake was alive with noise, boat motors, radios, the sharp cries of children throwing pebbles at the water's edge. But for the 4 cousins, it was a day promised to be just theirs. No distractions, no adults beyond Uncle Ray, who'd always been more a big brother than a guardian. They were close in the way only cousins can be, raised like siblings. Bonded by summers spent catching fireflies and whispering secrets across sleeping bags. Jordan, the oldest at 14, was quiet, cautious, and unshakably loyal. His sister Maddie, 12, was the wild one, brash and sun-freckled, always first to jump in. Then came Isaac, 10, deeply curious and painfully polite, the one who carried a field notebook even when he swam. And finally Lily, just 7, soft-spoken and wide-eyed, a child who looked at the world like it was always on the verge of magic. They loaded the boat just after noon. A few life jackets, a small cooler with sandwiches and grape soda, a cheap disposable camera they'd begged for at the gas station. Uncle Ray laughed as they shoved off, calling back to the shore, "Back by 5, or your mama's gonna skin me alive." It was the kind of moment so unremarkable in its joy that no one thought to hold on to it tighter. The kind of moment that felt too safe to matter. The boat cut smoothly across the lake, its motor humming against the stillness. Witnesses would later recall seeing it circle toward the southern inlet, a quieter part of the lake with rock formations and shaded coves. Some said they waved, others weren't sure if it was the same boat at all. Then, somewhere between 1:45 and 2:10 p.m., it vanished. Not exploded, not capsized, just stopped being seen. When the cousins didn't return by sunset, the families assumed the worst, but not the kind of worst they would soon come to know. Maybe the boat had stalled. Maybe they ran out of gas and were drifting. Maybe they'd decided to dock on the other side to fish, or swim, or climb rocks. But then the hours stretched. And stretched. Phone calls were made. Flashlights clicked on. By midnight, the lake was no longer a backdrop for summer, it was a crime scene in waiting. By dawn on the 3rd of July, the boat had been found, drifting near the reeds, half a mile from the cove. Empty, life jackets still inside, cooler half full, camera missing, no blood, no footprints on the nearby bank. It was as if the lake had exhaled then held its breath. The official reports would later struggle to define the moment of disappearance. No wreckage, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, just 4 names, printed in bold ink across 100 missing posters. 4 childhoods interrupted in a single afternoon beneath an untroubled sky. The sun had shone the entire time. The wind never picked up. And yet, something irreversible had taken place. Something that changed the lake forever. It was the absence that unsettled them most. Not the fear, not the grief, not even the endless waiting that followed. It was the absence, the kind that feels manufactured, as if something had scrubbed the truth clean. As if the event itself had never happened, only the consequence remained. The boat was discovered just after sunrise on the 3rd of July, nudged against the shore by a gentle breeze, as if it had come back on its own. Deputies were first on the scene. They approached slowly, unsure of what they would find. Expecting bodies, perhaps, or evidence of a crash. Instead, they found stillness. The boat bobbed lightly, tethered by nothing. Inside, the cooler sat unopened. 2 sandwiches gone, 2 untouched. 4 life jackets stacked neatly in a corner. 1 towel, damp. A paperback novel with its spine bent back. A pair of sunglasses resting on the seat as if someone had only just taken them off. There were no drag marks, no signs of panic or struggle, no frantic scratches on the wood, no broken equipment. It looked like a moment frozen in time, eerie in its normalcy. Divers were called immediately. By mid-morning, the lake was crawling with search teams, sonar boats, and scent dogs brought in from Waco. They scoured the water, the shore, the trails leading back toward the cabins, but nothing surfaced. The dogs caught a scent near a rocky outcropping on the eastern edge. Barked once, then circled, confused. The trail ended at the waterline. No tracks led away. The mud was undisturbed. The reeds stood upright. The questions multiplied faster than answers could keep up. How could 4 children vanish from a small craft on a monitored lake in broad daylight? Where were their bodies? Their voices? Why had no one heard anything, not a splash, not a cry, not even a distant engine speeding away? People began offering theories before the police even asked. Drowning was the first, simple, tragic, but plausible, yet the water gave up no one. Not in the first 48 hours, not in the months that followed. The FBI joined the investigation after 72 hours. They sent helicopters, analysts, profilers. Interviews were conducted with every visitor who had been at the lake that weekend. Locals were questioned again and again. Photos were reviewed for background clues, license plates, unfamiliar faces. None of it yielded a lead. The camera that had been brought aboard with the cousins was never found. Investigators considered whether it had sunk or been taken, or both. What haunted the agents most, years later, was the cleanliness of it. Not a scene, but a void. Like the entire incident had been erased, not by weather or time, but by deliberate human hands. There were no forensic breadcrumbs, no hair strands, no fingerprints that didn't belong, no torn fabric floating near shore. Just the vessel, adrift, their belongings inside, waiting. Almost expectantly. People say nature erodes memory, but this was something else. This wasn't the erosion of time. This was a deletion. And whoever or whatever was responsible had left nothing to mourn over but space. Space where voices should have echoed. Space where bodies should have been found. Space where the story should have ended. Instead, it began, quietly, under a sky that never warned them, on a lake that kept its secrets submerged. Time passed like sediment, slow, heavy, impossible to move. In the beginning, the families waited in clusters, huddled around police scanners and television broadcasts, speaking in low tones even when no one else was listening. They set up makeshift stations in their garages and kitchens, walls plastered with grainy photos and crude maps of the lake's contours. They took turns handing out flyers. They stared out windows like something might return on foot. But nothing ever did. After a while, the police stopped calling. Reporters stopped showing up. And what was left behind was quieter, harder to survive. Waiting that had no structure, only breath. Jordan and Maddie's mother, Teresa, kept a journal. The entries begin tight and frantic lists of people to call, dreams she couldn't shake, the sound of Maddie's voice on the answering machine. She wrote the date at the top of every page. Then, after a few months, she stopped dating them. The words continued, but the days no longer mattered. She wrote about making dinner for 3 instead of 5, about the cruel geometry of setting out fewer plates, about the way she started seeing her son in every boy on a bicycle, about the way her hands trembled when folding laundry, even when it wasn't theirs. Isaac's father became a collector of second-hand sightings. He kept a binder full of letters, strangers swearing they'd seen his son in Amarillo, or Tulsa, or New Mexico. Isaac was always described the same way, quiet, wide-eyed, clutching something in his hand. A stick, a feather, a notepad. The man traveled once, all the way to Utah, on the thinnest of tips. It was a boy with the same eyes, but not the same life. When he came back, he didn't speak for a week. Just sat on the porch in his work clothes, unmoving, as the sky turned from pink to ash. Lily's mother kept the child's room untouched for nearly 10 years. The sheets stayed tucked, the lamp still bore the sticker of a cartoon rabbit that had begun to peel with age. Every birthday, she left a small cake on the windowsill, one candle lit, until the breeze took it out. At first it was a ritual of hope, later, a surrender. The families met each July near the dock where the boat had launched. They brought chairs, thermoses, photographs curling at the edges. Sometimes they spoke, other times they just stared at the water. It wasn't about comfort, there was none to be found. It was about proximity. The lake had taken something from them, and they needed to stay close, if only to prove it had once been real. Photos of the cousins aged with them, only in imagination. Artists' sketches, renderings of what they might look like at 18, then 22, then 30 sat framed on mantels. But the families could never fully accept those portraits. They were outlines of strangers, not their children. Not really. Birthdays kept coming, so did the lake. Its waters rose and fell, indifferent. It shimmered through seasons, hosting weddings and fishing tournaments, drawing tourists who never knew the story. But for those who waited, the lake was never recreational. It was sacred and cruel, a mirror they couldn't look away from. A body holding what the earth refused to return. Clifton, Texas, sits quiet in the folds of Boss County, too small for secrets, too wide for closure. It's the kind of town where time doesn't move so much as repeat. The same storefronts, the same names on mailboxes, the same rhythms of life passing down like heirlooms. And yet, since 1995, something had gone unspoken, coiled just beneath the skin of the community. A wound sealed not by healing, but by habit. As if forgetting was easier when done collectively. People still talk about that summer, but only when pressed, and even then, the details shift like reflections on the lake. Ask one person, and the boat was seen near the bluff around 2 o'clock, HUDZO. Ask another, and it was 3. One swears they saw Uncle Ray at the gas station that morning, alone. Another says they saw a stranger, watching from the trees. Each version of the story is held with certainty. Each one contradicts the next. Over time, the contradictions hardened into something like folklore, not truth, but belief. There are those who still live in the same homes they did 30 years ago, their driveways cracked, their windows weathered. They remember the cousins not just as victims, but as neighbors. Jordan mowing lawns in the July heat, sweat darkening his collar. Maddie daring boys to jump from the rope swing near the river bend. Isaac, always drawing corners of napkins, margins of church bulletins. Lily, tiny and wordless, tagging behind the others like a shadow stitched to sunlight. Their names are carved into the town's memory, but rarely spoken aloud. At Clifton High, the hallways once echoed with their absence. Desks stayed empty for weeks after their disappearance, then were quietly reassigned. Teachers lowered their voices during roll call. Some students left for good, their families unable to stay in a town that made every street a reminder. Others stayed and tried to forget, but the forgetting never took. It calcified instead. Each year, the town hosted its annual barbecue festival, just days after the disappearance anniversary. It wasn't planned that way, it just happened. And yet the timing felt wrong. There were marching bands and pie-eating contests, the smell of meat in the air, and somewhere in the crowd, always, one of the grieving families would be seen standing still, watching. Not protesting, not mourning, just present. Like placeholders for something the town didn't want to carry anymore. In 1997, a mural was painted on the side of the old hardware store. It showed the lake, serene and blue, children playing along its banks. No names were written, no memorial, no plaque. Just a picture. A few years later, someone tagged it with red spray paint. They never left. It was power washed within hours, but the words had already burned into the town's conscience. Clifton didn't move on, it simply continued. Churches filled on Sundays, the football team played under Friday lights. The grocery store changed owners 3 times. But beneath the surface, there was a silence that felt curated. A careful choreography around a subject no one could resolve. The cousins were gone, yes, but they were never distant. They haunted the corners of conversations, lived in the quiet hesitations between sentences. They lingered like humidity, unseen but heavy, always there. In Clifton, forgetting wasn't an accident, it was a survival tactic. And yet, all it took was a single object, a shoe found decades later, for everything to stir again. The town may have practiced forgetting, but the past was waiting. Just under the surface, the footage was unearthed in a cardboard box, nearly forgotten in a dust-choked attic. It had sat there for decades, tucked beneath old Christmas decorations, broken tools, and a discolored quilt that still smelled faintly of cedar. The tape, marked simply Lake 2095, was handed over to authorities during a community outreach effort in early 2025. The man who gave it up hadn't watched it in years. "It was just a home movie," he said. "His family on vacation, nothing important." But he handed it over with a strange expression. The kind worn by people who suspect something before they fully understand what it is. The tape was digitized quietly, processed by a low-ranking tech at the FBI's Cold Case Division. No one expected it to matter. It opened with the usual static blur, then settled into a flickering image of sun-drenched lakefront kids running across gravel, coolers being lugged into boats, dogs barking off camera. The picture wobbled with every movement, the camera lens smeared with fingerprints, light bleeding in from every corner. Voices murmured in the background, laughter overlapped with shouts. Ordinary, noisy joy. Then came the panning shot, a slow, unsteady sweep across the open water, taken from one of the docks. The person filming seemed to be following a bird, or perhaps just killing time while others set up camp behind them. The camera passed over the lake, glinting hard under the July sun, and for just a moment, a single second, maybe less, a shape appeared in the far background. A boat. Not the one the cousins had taken. No one noticed at the time. The boat was small, distant, partially obscured by trees at the lake's edge. Its engine was off, or silent, because no hum could be heard. It sat still, unnervingly still, like it had anchored for reasons that didn't involve fishing or rest. It was too far to make out anyone on board. Just the vague geometry of a vessel floating where no one recalled there being one. The camera moved on. The moment passed. But when analysts paused, the footage slowed it down, enhanced it frame by frame. Something about the boat felt wrong. It wasn't the cousins' rented skiff. That was confirmed quickly. The shape was different, bulkier, with a dark canopy overhead. Records from that day were pulled. No boats matching its description were registered in the immediate area. Rangers who had been stationed at the lake that summer were contacted. None remembered a second boat being out in that particular inlet during the time the children disappeared. And yet, there it was, embedded in the film like a quiet dare, mocking the idea that it had ever been invisible. The discovery didn't solve anything. It didn't offer coordinates, names, or motives, but it shifted the temperature of the investigation. Until that moment, there had been nothing, no visual, no lead, just the void of their disappearance. Now there was something, a shadow in the past that shouldn't have been there. Even more chilling was the timing. Based on the angle of the sun, the position of the trees, and the sequence of nearby footage, the appearance of the unidentified boat aligned almost exactly with the window of the cousins' vanishing. Less than 30 minutes, give or take. An overlap in time, an overlap in place. A fragment of history caught on accident. When the man who had filmed the footage was shown the still frame, he grew quiet. Said he didn't remember ever seeing that boat. Said he'd watched the video once with his wife in 1996, and felt nothing unusual. But looking at it now, his hands trembled slightly. "I think I was filming birds," he said again, as if that mattered. The tape had waited nearly 30 years to be seen properly. And now that it had, the lake no longer looked quite the same. By the autumn of 1995, Lake Whitney had become less a place of leisure and more a stage for quiet desperation. The tourists had long packed up their campers and boats. Only the search teams remained, divers in black suits, wading into the shallows with unreadable faces. Boats, lined with sonar equipment, slicing slow, deliberate lines across the water, and helicopters scarring the sky in wide, pointless circles. They came in shifts, working by grid, charting the lake like cartographers of absence. But Lake Whitney did not give easily. In November, cadaver dogs were brought in from out of state, highly trained animals accustomed to the scent of decay beneath water and soil. On the third morning, One of the dogs barked sharply, its hackles rising near a narrow inlet on the eastern edge of the lake. The trainers marked the location and dropped weighted flags into the water. Divers entered within the hour. They found nothing. The dog did not react again. Not that day, not ever. The following week, a psychic from Houston contacted the families, claiming she'd had a vision for children in an underground space, cold and crying, somewhere near Limestone. The families, exhausted by science and logic, listened. Some even believed. A cave system was searched on private land 20 miles north. It led to nothing but dust and raccoon tracks. Rumors began as they always do, in fragments, in whispers, fueled by fear and the unbearable vacuum of certainty. One theory pointed to a local man with a record for voyeurism who lived near the lake. He was interrogated, his home searched, his alibi thin but verifiable. Another suggested a traveling carnival had passed through Clifton weeks before the disappearance, and that one of the workers had been arrested for child endangerment in another state. The lead was followed. The trail went cold. By 1997, whispers had grown darker. Some said the children had been taken by a cult, that they were being raised in secret as part of some twisted commune, that they'd been renamed, brainwashed. A journalist from Dallas tried to connect the disappearance to a broader pattern of missing children across Texas. His article, heavily speculative, was retracted within weeks, but it lingered. Like everything else, trafficking was the next fear, whispered more than spoken aloud. The word felt too large, too global, too grotesque to belong to their small, rural world. But it hung over the families like a smog, choking even their most hopeful thoughts. And then there was the theory no one said out loud, but everyone considered Uncle Ray. He had been the last adult to see them. The one who took them out. The one who came back alone. But there was no evidence, no motive, no body, no confession. And perhaps most tellingly, no will to destroy a man already living in a kind of quiet ruin. The lake was drained, partially in the spring of 1999, during a drought that had shriveled the edges of every Texas reservoir. Debris was found: sunken logs, rusted shopping carts, the shell of a car stolen in 1982. But no children, no boat fragments, no answers. Each investigation, each tip, each whispered accusation ended in the same place: nowhere. The search teams packed up. The sonar boats stopped coming. The lake settled back into its deceptive stillness. But in Clifton, people still looked twice at strangers, locked doors earlier, changed routes home. The families had nothing, not even bones to bury. And as the years slipped forward, the search for truth was buried beneath a different kind of sediment, the weight of too many maybes, too many dead ends. And beneath it all, the lake remained, unmoved, unbothered, unreadable. A body of water deep enough to hide 1,000 truths and still reflect the sky as if nothing had ever gone wrong. In early 2007, a letter arrived at the Bosque County Sheriff's Department. It was written in shaky block letters, smudged with fingerprints and folded so many times the creases had begun to tear. It came from a state correctional facility in Arkansas. The man who wrote it, a convicted felon named Randall Keith Dobson, claimed he had information about the missing cousins from Lake Whitney. The letter was short, almost breathless in tone, as if scrawled in a fever. I saw the kids, years back, locked up, storm drain near Waco. I didn't know who they were until I saw a flyer. I can take you there. I remember their faces. The message hit like a slow detonation. After 12 years of silence, of useless leads and hollow anniversaries, the idea that anyone had seen them alive after that day, sparked something dangerous in the hearts of the families. Hope. Raw, unfiltered, and fragile. The FBI reopened the case file within 48 hours. Dobson was interviewed under caution, escorted into a windowless room with a federal agent and a tape recorder that clicked louder than it needed to. His story was disjointed, full of gaps, punctuated by long silences. He said he'd been squatting in an abandoned building outside Waco in late 1996, running drugs, staying out of sight. One night, while hiding from a passing police car, he ducked into a culvert and followed it into a storm drain. That's where he saw them, he said. 4 kids, pale and frightened, locked behind a rusted steel grate. He didn't talk to them, he just watched. One of them had freckles, one was crying. When asked why he hadn't said anything sooner, he shrugged. Didn't think it mattered. Thought they was just runaways or something. But I seen a poster again last week. It was her, the little girl, the one with the ribbon. Authorities dispatched excavation teams immediately. The drain system Dobson described ran under an industrial park that had since been paved over. Crews jackhammered through asphalt, removed slabs of concrete, and descended into the network of tunnels with flashlights and respirators. The air was stale and thick, dust clung to the walls like mildew. They found rusted cans, scraps of plastic, remnants of a mattress long since rotted into fibers, but nothing else. No bones, no names carved into cement, no evidence of captivity. Dobson was brought back in. He adjusted his story. Maybe it wasn't Waco, he said. Maybe it was Tyler or Austin. Maybe it wasn't a storm drain at all. Maybe it was a basement. He looked confused, disoriented, like a man trying to reassemble a dream while the pieces kept slipping through his fingers. Eventually, he admitted it. He made it up, for attention, for parole leverage. He recanted with a shrug, as if what he had taken from the families was negligible. But it wasn't. It never was. The damage had already been done. The families, drawn once more toward the edge of belief, were forced back into that liminal space between knowing and never knowing. The storm drain remained empty. Dobson's name was quietly buried beneath a mound of discarded leads, another entry in a file already bloated with false starts and misremembered sightings. And yet, even in its failure, the whisper lingered. The image of the 4 children behind steel bars stayed lodged in the minds of those who loved them. It wasn't the truth, but it had felt like it. And sometimes, in the absence of answers, even lies leave shadows that are impossible to shake. Water has always been a paradox. It carves and conceals, cradles and destroys. It holds time like breath, letting it linger just beneath the surface. And in the case of Lake Whitney, it became both a grave and a shrine, though no grave was ever found, and no shrine ever built. The cousins vanished into it, and for 30 years, the lake wore their absence like a mirror, smooth and untouchable. There is a kind of silence that only water understands. It doesn't echo like the empty rooms of a missing child's bedroom, or linger like the smell of clothing left too long in a drawer. It is absolute. It swallows what it's given, not out of malice, but because that is its nature. The lake does not remember in the way humans do. It does not mark anniversaries. It does not draw faces in fogged glass or whisper names into pillows at night. It forgets slowly, without ceremony. And yet, water preserves. A photograph lost in the shallows may resurface years later, ink blurred but still legible. A coin dropped from a boat might nestle into the silt and remain there, untouched, long after the hands that held it are gone. But memory, true memory, is different. Memory is fallible, shifting. It is not what remains under the surface, but what erodes above it. The town of Clifton learned this the hard way. As years passed and no new evidence surfaced, the cousins became less people and more story. Their real names, Jordan, Maddie, Isaac, Lily, began to dissolve like chalk in rain, replaced by something more symbolic. The Whitney Four, people called them, as if branding them would soften the ache. Their lives became shorthand for loss. A cautionary tale. A ghost story whispered at the edges of barbecues and schoolyard rumors. But who were they, really? Not the sketches pinned to bulletin boards or the age-progressed images printed on flyers. Not the guesses of psychics or the blurred forms and shaky footage. They were children once. They liked grape soda. They argued over radio stations. They believed, with the stubbornness only the young possess, that nothing bad could happen on a sunny day. And then they were gone. What the water took, it took, without violence. There was no crashing wave, no swirling current, just a vanishing too clean. And in that absence, the stories grew. Some said the lake was cursed. Others believed the cousins had never really died at all, that they had been taken into some hidden world beneath the surface, like Persephone into the underworld. The human mind, after all, will shape myth from uncertainty, just to keep breathing. Closure is often spoken of as an endpoint, a line drawn under tragedy. But for those who waited, closure was not a door gently closing. It was the echo of footsteps that never returned. It was the sound of water lapping against the shore, again and again, each wave a reminder that some answers stay submerged. And so the cousins remained suspended in time, not by the lake itself, but by the imaginations and grief of those left behind. Not wholly gone, but not truly here. Preserved in the way only the lost can be, not as they were, but as the world needed them to be. Innocent, untouched, eternal. It arrived on a Tuesday, no fanfare, no warning. Just a small battered envelope dropped through a mail slot in a quiet neighborhood outside Albuquerque. The house belonged to Franklin Ames, a retired FBI agent known more for his unflinching composure than for any one case. He had worked missing persons out of Dallas for over 2 decades, his name barely remembered now outside the fading ink of archived reports. But once, in the summer of 1995, his phone had rung in the middle of the night, and the names Jordan, Maddie, Isaac, and Lily had entered his life like an open wound. He'd carried them with him ever since, tucked into the part of himself he didn't speak of, the part that never accepted how quietly the world let 4 children disappear. The envelope had no markings, no return address, no postage stamp, just his name, written in shaky cursive. Inside was a single Polaroid, the white border yellowing at the edges. He stared at it for a long time, at first without understanding, then without breath. 4 figures, teenagers, huddled tightly in what looked like the corner of a dimly lit room, concrete walls, exposed pipes overhead. Their wrists were bound with thin cord, their ankles too. Their faces told the story before the details did. Eyes wide with something deeper than fear, something exhausted and hollow. But it was their faces, aged, yet familiar, that made his hands begin to tremble. He recognized them. All 4. It wasn't possible, it shouldn't have been. But there they were, older, undeniably. Not children, but not quite adults. Somewhere in that disorienting middle space, where the bones of their youth remained visible beneath the new lines of time, Jordan's brow had furrowed into something sharper, more protective. Maddie's jaw clenched in defiance, her eyes burning. Isaac looked small, still, but no longer a boy. And Lily's gaze was aimed directly at the camera. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming. She was simply looking, as if she'd been waiting to be seen. Ames sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes before moving again. He checked the envelope for fibers, fingerprints, any trace of whoever had sent it. Nothing. The paper was clean. Too clean. The photo was recent, maybe within the last 6 months. The light temperature, the clothing, the faint logo on the wall in the background blurred but distinct. A name, a hint, a ghost trail. He made the call to Washington that night, bypassing protocol, waking contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. The photograph was scanned, analyzed, confirmed. These were not children. But they were the cousins. Or rather, they had been once. The tip fractured the case open like a sealed vault. The cold files were pulled from digital purgatory. The families, still suspended in their grief, were contacted one by one. None of them asked, "Are you sure?" Not a single one. Because certainty had never belonged to this case, only absence. And now this. The image spread through secure channels like a storm. No demands had been made, no contact since. Just the photo. A declaration. A cruel confirmation that they had been somewhere all along. Held. Hidden. A truth almost worse than death. They had been alive. And someone had known exactly where to find them. The compound sat like a secret in the dust, folded into a dry valley in northern Arizona, where the rocks rose like broken teeth and the wind rarely carried sound. From above, it looked like nothing, just scrubland and dirt roads, a patch of desert ignored by most maps. But underground, beneath layers of reinforced concrete and decades of misdirection, was a network of rooms engineered not for hiding, but for sustaining a reality apart from the world. A false world. A closed system. One man's idea of permanence. The raid was planned with precision and silence. No helicopters, no sirens. Just black vehicles under moonlight. Tires softened to muffle their arrival. The agents moved like shadows, coordinated, wordless, dressed in matte gear designed to reflect nothing. The entrance, a rusted trailer mounted into a slope, gave no indication of what lay beneath it. But inside, behind false panels and a staircase that led downward for 22 steps, the truth began to reveal itself. The rooms were immaculate, not lavish, sterile, curated. Walls painted a soft cream, floors smoothed concrete, each corner free of dust. There was a kitchen with labeled shelves, a classroom with chalk still in the tray, a long hallway lined with corkboards and handwritten schedules that hadn't changed in years. 4 bedrooms, each with a single bed, a desk, and carefully organized possessions. Books arranged alphabetically, clothing folded with obsessive precision. Nothing personal enough to be messy. Nothing chaotic enough to be free. The cousins were found in the common room, sitting at a round table beneath fluorescent light. No screams, no scramble, no sign of fight or panic. They looked up when the door burst open, and they blinked, not at the agents, but at the world rushing in behind them. There was a silence then, thick and still, broken only by the smallest sound. Lily's chair scraping against the floor as she stood, the first to move. Her voice, when it came, was dry and weightless. "Is it real?" she asked. No one answered, because in that moment, none of them knew how to. Agents swept the rooms methodically. They found journals, dozens of them stacked in neat piles, written in a single hand. Pages chronicled daily activities, behavioral observations, memories reconstructed and edited. The entries were about the cousins, but never from them. They were studied, analyzed, almost like case subjects. Every emotion charted, every deviation noted. Elias Morton had been watching, documenting. He had made himself their historian. There were no screens, no phones, no televisions. A single radio, dismantled, its wires frayed and soldered into a tangle of harmless parts. One of the agents later said it felt like stepping into a museum, diorama life frozen in time, arranged for a viewer who never came. The surface structure had been registered under a series of false names, shell companies and real estate transfers buried so deep that even with modern forensics, it took days to untangle the paperwork. Power had been routed through solar panels concealed among desert brush. Supplies had been delivered by a network of drop points, the paths covered in tire tracks layered like palimpsests. And at the center of it all, 4 young adults who hadn't seen a screen in 30 years. They didn't recognize the logos on the agents' vests. They didn't understand the phones they were handed. They didn't flinch at the sight of guns, but they did shy away from cameras. Jordan kept asking what year it was. Maddie refused to speak until her wrists were unbound, even though they hadn't been tied. Isaac wept when he saw the sky. Lily stood still, her face turned toward the door, eyes narrowed against the sun beginning to rise. She didn't look back, not once. In that forgotten corner of Arizona, The truth had been buried beneath decades of dust, deception, and illusion. But now it had surfaced, not triumphant, not loud. Just there finally, undeniably there. They spoke slowly, like people learning to use language again. Words came in fragments, scattered between long silences and searching glances, as if they were unsure which memories were theirs and which had been shaped for them. No single story emerged, not all at once. Instead, pieces surfaced like artifacts lifted carefully from mud and time, revealing a life too strange to call imprisonment, too controlled to call freedom. Jordan, the oldest, remembered the first days in flashes, the smell of damp concrete, the metallic clink of a lock behind them. The man Elias smiling with a kind of softness that should have been comforting, but wasn't. He told them they were safe now. That the world had broken, and they were the lucky ones. That outside, there was sickness, war, collapse. But here, with him, they would be preserved, protected, loved. Jordan didn't believe him, not then. But when no one came, and the days kept folding into each other without change, belief stopped mattering. He became the protector, not just of the others, but of the story they needed to survive. He nodded when Elias spoke, even when he wanted to scream. He obeyed. He learned how to disappear in plain sight. Maddie never stopped resisting, not in the way Jordan did. She argued, pushed back, asked questions Elias refused to answer. She once spent 3 days in complete silence, not as punishment but protest. Elias didn't retaliate. He just watched, took notes, said things like, "She's entering another phase," as though she were an experiment shifting through developmental stages. Maddie remembered the day she tried to escape, how the outer hallway had no end, only a loop that fed back into itself. A trick of architecture or of perception, she was never sure. But when she returned, hours later, blistered and dehydrated, Elias didn't scold her. He just handed her water and said, "Now you know." Isaac retreated inward. He was 10 when they were taken, old enough to remember the world, young enough to let it fade. He found order in the repetition, morning exercises, afternoon lessons, evening quiet time. Elias taught them astronomy, literature, even basic chemistry. Isaac absorbed it all like a sponge. But his notebooks were different. He didn't document what Elias taught. He documented the irregularities, the click patterns of the lights, the inconsistent power surges, the way Elias sometimes stared too long at the ceiling when he thought no one was looking. He kept these notes hidden beneath the floor panel of his room, a secret map of a world that made no sense, a logic built in shadows. Lily was the one Elias watched most closely. She had been just 7 when it happened. Too young to question. Too young to hold onto the old world tightly. He treated her like something sacred, called her his winter. She spoke little in those years, observed more than expressed. But she remembered everything. Where each camera had been placed, the scent of Elias's breath, the hum of the generator before it failed once, for nearly 3 hours. She said nothing of these things until she was free. Then, she told them all. Calmly. In detail. As if reciting a story that had already been told inside her 1,000 times. Elias, their captor, had once been trusted. A neighbor, a family friend. He had no interest in ransom, no manifesto to share. He didn't harm them, at least not in the ways that leave marks on the skin. He fed them, sheltered them, taught them. But he erased them, rewrote their reality one gentle lie at a time. He didn't want them dead. He wanted them still, suspended. Like pieces in a museum he curated alone, admired in the privacy of obsession. And the cousins, they lived. Not as children. Not as prisoners. As something in between. As ghosts made to breathe, walk, and study beneath the weight of someone else's idea of love. And for 30 years, they stayed in that delicate silence. Not screaming, not forgotten. Simply kept. Elias Morton had once walked among ordinary people. He paid his taxes, held doors open for strangers, and taught summer science programs at the community center, where parents trusted him and children forgot to fear him. He was articulate in that soft, academic way that made people think he was harmless, bookish, maybe lonely, but nothing more. No one suspected what he would become, or perhaps what he already was. He had studied anthropology in college, fixated on lost cultures, rituals of preservation, the notion of time as something that could be controlled. His professors called him promising, if peculiar. His thesis, never published, was titled The Fragility of Memory and the Construction of Myth in Isolated Systems. He had argued that societies only decay when they are allowed to change. That permanence was not natural, but it could be forced. He never earned his doctorate. Funding dried up. His proposals became too abstract, too unsettling. He left quietly, retreated from academia, and disappeared into the quiet folds of American obscurity. Over the years, he amassed a private archive. Diaries, field notes, case studies of cults and communes, blueprints for shelters, journals filled with thoughts on identity and entropy. His handwriting, small and tightly looped, filled thousands of pages. He wrote obsessively about childhood not as innocence, but as structure, a phase of predictability, of patterns. He believed children were the last true expressions of humanity before corruption set in. He believed he could save them by suspending them. When the cousins vanished in 1995, no one connected Elias to the event. He had volunteered in the community, once sat at the same picnic tables as the families he would later steal from. He had been a peripheral figure, remembered by adults only faintly, as that teacher who liked fossils. But to the cousins, he was familiar enough to trust for one moment, and one moment was all he needed. He constructed the compound with calculated care. Over the course of 5 years, he purchased parcels of land under shell companies. He imported materials in parts, never from the same vendor twice. He built underground, room by room, replicating the structure of a life arrested in time. He wasn't cruel, but he was thorough. He monitored their routines, controlled their exposure, and removed all reminders of the outside world. He never beat them, never screamed. He wanted obedience, but more than that, he wanted continuity. He wanted preservation. He called them his 4 seasons. Jordan was autumn, steady, watchful, fading. Maddie was summer, volatile, radiant, defiant. Isaac, spring, curious, growing, delicate. And Lily, winter, quiet, still, unchanging. In his journals, he described them as representations of temporal harmony. He did not name them by their real names. He rarely acknowledged their pasts. To Elias, they had been reborn the moment they entered his world. When the FBI breached the compound, he did not run. He did not speak. He raised his hands calmly and nodded, as if he had been expecting the end all along. As if he had fulfilled his role and was ready to be archived himself. In interrogation, he spoke in metaphors. He quoted ancient texts. He asked questions instead of answering them. "What is the cost of protecting beauty?" he once asked an agent. "Would you let a butterfly fly into a storm, or would you pin it safely behind glass?" He never expressed remorse. Not once. He didn't see what he had done as evil. He saw it as necessary, as an act of curation. He believed the world was a place that forgot too easily. That time was an enemy. And so he became its opponent. The archivist of lives he didn't create, but believed he could preserve, forever. They landed in Texas beneath a slate-colored sky, the kind that seemed to hover rather than stretch. The plane touched down quietly, as if reluctant to disturb the moment. There were no reporters waiting on the tarmac, no banners, no triumphant music. Just officials in plain suits, and families holding flowers that had started to wilt in the heat. It was a homecoming, but not the kind anyone imagined. Jordan stepped off the plane first, taller than his father remembered. Shoulders squared with a kind of weight that had nothing to do with muscle. Maddie followed, her face tight, arms crossed, not in defiance but in armor. Isaac walked slower, glancing at the concrete beneath his feet like it might give way. Lily was last. She held nothing. She looked nowhere. The reunion was not explosive. There were no embraces that mended decades. The hugs came, but cautiously, as if each gesture might crack something fragile between them. The parents cried. Of course they did. Teresa fell to her knees in front of Jordan, her hands shaking as she touched his face, whispering his name again and again like a prayer. Maddie's mother couldn't stop staring, murmuring, "My baby," as if saying it enough might make it true again. Isaac's father reached for his son, but the boy, now a man, hesitated. They stood close, but not touching, as if both needed time to recalibrate what reunion really meant. Lily's mother tried to take her hand, but Lily turned away gently, her eyes fixed on a line of ants trailing across the runway's edge. They were not children anymore, and the homes they returned to were no longer the ones they had left. Bedrooms had been repainted, toys boxed away, photographs faded behind the glass. The towns had changed. Schools had been rebuilt. Their friends had grown up, moved on, married, vanished. Strangers now lived where their childhoods had once bloomed. Therapists met with each of them, every day at first, then twice a week, then as needed. But even therapy couldn't bridge the distance time had carved. The cousins shared something deeper than trauma. They shared an unreality that others couldn't touch. They had lived together in a world apart, shaped by rules and rhythms no one else could understand. The world now seemed loud, fast, fractured. Cell phones startled them. Crowds overwhelmed. Mirrors felt like accusations. Television felt like noise. Maddie spoke the most, when she did speak. She described Elias in calm, precise detail, as if recounting a story that belonged to someone else. Jordan often remained silent during sessions, but when he did speak, it was with clarity, as if trying to restore something lost to the air. Isaac asked questions, about the world, about what he had missed, about whether he could ever go to school. But Lily said nothing. Weeks passed, then months. Her lips moved only when necessary, yes, no, here, there. But never more, no explanations, no memories. The professionals called it selective mutism. Her family called it grief. But to those who knew her best, it felt like something else entirely. As if words had belonged to a life that no longer fit. As if silence had become her only form of control. The cousins visited the lake once, quietly, unannounced. They stood at the edge of the dock, where it all began, staring out at water that shimmered like nothing had changed. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They simply stood. Together. It was not closure. It was not healing. It was presence. A fragile, flickering thing. They had come home, yes. But not to the past. And not, entirely, to themselves. In a basement below the FBI field office in Phoenix, there is a room marked simply as Evidence 6B. Inside it are boxes, 47 of them, stacked meticulously, each one catalogued, labeled, and sealed. This is where the story of the compound truly resides. Not in the headlines. Not in the courtroom. But in these boxes, where the lives of 4 stolen children were recorded by the man who took them. The agents who processed the evidence did so with quiet dread. There were no bones, no physical wounds, nothing grotesque in the traditional sense. But what they found was, in many ways, worse. It was meticulous, obsessive, a museum of the mind that created the prison. There were drawings, hundreds, all done by the children over the years. Some were rudimentary. Trees, stars, faces half-formed and smudged. Others were eerily detailed. One depicted the compound from a cutaway perspective, with rooms labeled in neat handwriting: quiet room, learning hall, Elias's library. Another showed a figure watching from a camera, always drawn without a face. The cousins had known, at some level, that they were being observed not as people, but as objects in a carefully controlled study. Dozens of cassette tapes were discovered in a locked steel cabinet. Elias had recorded his voice, monologues layered with theory, delusion, and ritual. He narrated their days in a voice smooth and calm, as if reciting bedtime stories. "Spring woke late today," he said in one. "He seems to struggle with transitions." Another more chilling. "Winter is beginning to resist the stillness. I will recalibrate her rhythms." Most disturbing were the letters, hundreds of them, handwritten in careful script, never addressed to anyone real. Elias wrote to imaginary officials, to philosophical thinkers long dead, to future caretakers. The letters detailed his intentions: to preserve, to purify, to protect the seasons from the chaos of the outside world. He referenced historical collapse, entropy, and the myth of innocence. Each letter read like a sermon disguised as a journal entry, preaching not to justify, but to affirm his worldview. He believed he had saved them. One letter simply read, "Time cannot be trusted, so I removed them from it." There were also lists, behavioral charts, reward systems, entries tracking facial expressions, tone of voice, sleep cycles. He graded them like a teacher, observing changes, punishing deviations with silence rather than force. It was not brutality, but architecture. A calculated shaping of human lives to fit within the walls of his belief. The prosecutors would later review the material, but choose not to use most of it in court. "Too much," they said. "Too dense, too disturbing." It wouldn't aid conviction, it would confuse. The jury didn't need to hear Elias say, in his own voice, "They are no longer of the world. They belong to the archive." They didn't need to read the pages where he described Maddie as fiery chaos tamed, or Isaac as pliable but increasingly curious. It was enough to know he had kept them. That he had lied. That he had stolen time and replaced it with ritual. And so, most of it remains sealed, locked in the quiet sterility of that evidence room. The truth is there, but not for the public, not for the jury, just for history. A quiet testament to what control can look like when disguised as care. A shrine to one man's madness, and the lives he tried unsuccessfully to shape into stillness. The courtroom was packed, but it felt hollow. No outbursts, no gasps, just the steady hum of an air conditioner and the quiet scratching of pens on legal pads. Elias Morton sat at the defense table with the same composure he'd held from the beginning. Hands folded, shoulders straight, eyes blank. He didn't look at the victims. He didn't look at the jury. He stared forward, as if waiting for something else entirely. Something only he could see. The trial had lasted 6 weeks. Every day, the gallery held faces both familiar and strange: parents, neighbors, investigators, the press. Some came looking for answers. Others came looking for justice. But most came simply because they couldn't not. There was no defense to speak of. Elias never denied what he'd done. The facts were not in question. He had taken 4 children. He had kept them for 3 decades. He had built a life around their captivity and called it preservation. His lawyers tried to argue diminished capacity. The jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, psychological abuse. He was sentenced to life without parole. The judge read the sentence without ceremony, as though handing down a weather report. Elias nodded once. That was all. He said nothing. Not before. Not after. The family stood outside the courthouse afterward, surrounded by reporters and cameras. Some offered statements prepared, practiced, empty in all the ways words become when grief has nowhere left to go. Jordan and Maddie didn't speak to the press. Isaac stood behind his father, silent. Lily wasn't there at all. Justice, they were told, had been served. The system had worked, but none of it felt like justice. There was no reclamation, no restitution. What had been stolen wasn't just time, it was continuity. Childhoods had been broken off mid-sentence and never resumed. Parents had aged without closure. Siblings had grown up with holes in their families, their memories edited by absence. And now, even with a verdict, the weight didn't lift. It just settled deeper. 2 weeks later, Clifton held a vigil by the lake. It wasn't official. No flyers, no announcements. Word passed quietly, neighbor to neighbor. By dusk, more than 200 people had gathered along the shoreline. Some carried candles. Others brought old photos, taped to wooden stakes and stuck in the earth. Jordan stood near the water's edge, hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon. Maddie stayed back in the crowd, barely visible. Isaac sat on a bench alone, his fingers tracing a pattern on the wood. Lily arrived late. She didn't carry a candle, she didn't speak. She just stood barefoot in the shallows, her reflection rippling in the water as the wind finally stirred. No speeches were given, no prayers recited, just silence. And above it all, the lake remained unchanged. It did not shimmer, it did not weep. It did not acknowledge the ceremony unfolding at its edge. It simply held the sky, as it always had, indifferent to what lived or died beneath its surface. There was no apology in its stillness, no confession, only echo. Justice had been delivered, but it did not echo. Not really. What echoed were the names, the faces, the years that couldn't be returned. And in the quiet, they realized what the lake had always known. Some things, once taken, do not come back. Not entirely, not ever. The footage had already been combed through countless times, frame by frame, pixel by pixel. Analysts, agents, journalists, and internet sleuths had dissected every second of the grainy home video from that distant July afternoon. The known details had long since become etched into the narrative. The panning shot across the lake, the cousins laughing in the distance, the silent boat adrift in the background. For years, it was all static and mystery. But after the rescue, after Elias Morton had been sentenced and the cousins returned, the footage was examined again, this time not for clues, but for context. Closure, something like it, anyway. That's when someone saw her. She appears in exactly 3 frames, less than half a second, near the tree line at the far right edge of the screen, barely visible, blurred, almost part of the background. But undeniably there, a child, small, still, alone. Her outline is sharp enough to make out the shape of her limbs, the pale color of her clothing. She isn't moving, she's watching. She isn't one of the 4. The discovery rippled through the case files like a fault line reopening. At first, the assumption was error, camera noise, a trick of light, a lens flare that happened to form a human shape, but frame enhancement confirmed it. A 5th child. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who wasn't accounted for in any report, any interview, any witness recollection. She wasn't standing with the cousins. She wasn't on the dock. She was on the shoreline, deeper in the trees. As if she'd been placed just outside the story. When the cousins were asked gently, cautiously about the image, only Isaac answered. He said he remembered another child. Not a name, not a face, just a presence. He said he thought it was a dream. That sometimes, in the compound, he would hear footsteps when no one else was awake. That once, when he was very young, he thought he saw someone standing behind the observation glass, a girl with long hair, who vanished before he could speak. The others said nothing, not in confirmation, not in denial, just silence. The FBI reopened a line of inquiry that had long gone dormant. They began reviewing missing persons cases in Texas and neighboring states that bore resemblance in timing, geography, or method. Dozens of names, dozens of families still waiting. A few cases showed patterns that felt eerily familiar, small details, shared anomalies. But nothing conclusive. No fingerprints, no photographs, no DNA. Elias Morton never spoke of a 5th child. Not in his journals, not in the tapes, not in court. His records were obsessively focused on the for his seasons. There was no mention of a prior attempt, no failed subject, no departure. But that omission spoke loudest of all. Elias recorded everything. He archived emotion, movement, growth. If a fifth child had been there, and wasn't anymore, the absence of documentation may have been intentional. A redaction, a deletion. Theories spread quickly. Had Elias tried before? Had there been others before the cousins, or after? Survivors who didn't survive? Victims who had no name, no family searching, no one to ask where they'd gone? The footage, once dismissed as atmospheric filler, became something more. A haunted artifact. A suggestion that the story wasn't as contained as they'd hoped. That there were corners of the past still veiled. That the truth might be even more fractured than they'd imagined. The girl in the tape never moves. She never waves. She never blinks. She just watches. From the trees, from the edge of knowing, and then she's gone. There are places where time doesn't pass, it waits. Not in minutes or hours, but in quiet suspensions, like breath held just beneath the surface. Lake Whitney was one of those places. It didn't roar or thrash. It whispered. It kept its stories beneath the silt, beneath the roots of cattails and the shifting tides of memory. For 30 years, it held a silence so complete, so perfect, that even grief began to mimic its stillness. People stopped asking questions. The edges of photographs curled. Names faded in school halls. The missing became myth, and the myth became background. But silence is not emptiness, and stillness is not peace. Beneath its surface, the lake remembered. It remembered the weight of the boat, the tremble in Lily's hands, the way Jordan stared into the trees just before the world went wrong. It remembered Elias Morton, his careful steps, his stolen plans. It remembered the moment childhood ended, not in a scream, but in a decision, a single step onto a boat, toward someone they thought they knew. It remembered because memory is not only human. Sometimes it seeps into water, into land, into the hollow places where time pools like stagnant air. We think of loss as something linear, a beginning, a middle, an end. A moment of vanishing followed by years of longing. But not all losses stay buried. Some fester, some bide their time. Some claw their way back through layers of denial and dust, rising up like old bones through the cracks of a dry lakebed when the summer sun has burned away what was meant to stay hidden. The cousins were returned, but not restored. What was taken from them was not just years, it was shape, it was sequence. Time lost its spine. Their lives, once headed somewhere, were suspended like insects in amber. They learned how to smile again, yes. How to eat in restaurants, how to answer questions with practiced calm. But some things remained sealed. Some names they didn't speak. Some memories they didn't untangle. The world had gone on without them, and rejoining it was like stepping into a conversation that had started long before they arrived. And Elias, he is gone now. Buried in a prison cemetery under a number instead of a name. He died as quietly as he lived, no final confession, no revelations. But even in death, he left something behind. Not just the damage, not just the silence, but the question. The possibility. The shape of someone else in the corner of a frame. The unfinished line in the narrative. The child no one could name. The girl in the trees. The water gave them back, eventually, but only part way. It never gives everything. That's the lie we tell ourselves when we search lakes, dig up fields, follow maps through forests, that we can retrieve the whole truth. That what was buried can return intact. But what the lake returns is what it chooses. Altered, weathered, fragmented, and yet, it did return them. After all the years, after all the silence. Not because the world was listening, but because the water, at last, decided to speak.